In this session, we will cover what are form validation and how we can use validation with template-driven form in Angular application. Before I start the tutorial, I would like to request you, if you have still not subscribed to this channel, then please subscribe to it and don't forget to click on the notification bell icon to get notification whenever I upload a new video on this channel. So let's start today's tutorial. So first of all, it's important to understand what are the validations and why we require the validations in a form. Validations are important because they validate your page while getting the data on a form and as well as after we receive the data on controller, so that we will receive only that data which is required as per our application or which is suitable to store in our database. And the traditional way to validate HTML form is by using JavaScript custom functions, which are time consuming and most of the time are not user friendly. But in Angular, it provides a full-fledged framework with excellent support for validating user inputs and displaying the validation message at the same time. And it has lots of commonly used built-in validator that you can use easily. So let's discuss about what type of validations a template-driven form provide in Angular. So Angular has some built-in validators to validate common use case. In order to use built-in validator, you would need to apply validation attributes to each form field where you want some validation. These validation attributes are the same as regular HTML5 validation attributes like required, minimum length, max length, email, etc. And whenever value of a form changes, Angular generates a list of validation error by running validation. If the list is empty, it means it's a valid state, otherwise it's an invalid state. So using the same way, we have few classes we can use with template-driven forms like ngTouch, nguntouch, ngdirty, ngpristine, ngvalid, and nginvalid. So let's discuss about them one by one, and we will also see a practical example with all these classes using template-driven form. So ngTouch used when a control has been visited. So whenever user click on that control, the ngTouch class has been applied to a control. And the same way, by default, the nguntouched class has already been applied there. And the same way, ngpristine is already attached with a control and it's checked for value of control that has not been changed till the value of control has not been changed, and whenever we change its value, the ngdirty class attached to a control. The ngvalid applied to a control whenever control is valid means it passes all the validation applied to that control, and the same way nginvalid tells us that control has some invalid value. So let's open Visual Studio Code and see a practical session with validation in template-driven form. So here I'm using the same project which we used for template and reactive forms. So if you have still not watched that tutorials, then you can get the link in description of this video. So first of all, let's discuss the validation. What are the default validation and default classes applied to a control? So the application is already running on port 4200, and let me reload it again, and let's open the developer tool and check for this control, and you can see that by default three classes are already applied here. nguntouched, which means that the control has still not visited. Second is ngpristine, which means that the control value has still not changed, and nginvalid because this control has a attribute required applied on it. You can see here we applied a required attribute here, so that's why it says that it's invalid. So whenever I put any information to it, you can check that nguntouched will be changed to ngtouched. That means the control has been visited. Instead of ngpristine, the value changed to ngdirty. That means that value of control has been changed, and because the only validation applied here is required. So whenever I put an information, it changed to ng valid instead of ng invalid. So let me add here mark, and you can see that the control has been changed to ng touched, ng valid, and ng dirty. So the same way you can also check that in a class the form is currently invalid, because till we did not fill the information in all the controls, the form will get remain invalid, and till the form is invalid the button is not enabled here. So you can check that we applied a check here that till the registration form is not valid, the register button will get disabled. So if I add the value in all the fields, then you can check that the form is now a valid form, and we can also click on that register button. And when I click on register button, again form will get reset and default classes automatically applied to the form as well as all the controls. So with the help of all these classes, we can also show a validation message to user on a form, and we can also apply style sheets on a form. So let's see how we can achieve this. So first of all, let me close this as well, and let's open the style sheet file. So instead of this inline style, let's add a style sheet file with the template form, and let me add a file. So let me copy the name and add a file here .css, and instead of this style, let's add it as a style url s and pass name of the file. And add few validations here, like if our input box has a class ng touched, means that our control has been touched and its value is still invalid, and invalid class is applied to it. Then what we will do, that we will color the border of the control to red. Border color should be red. Let's save it, and you can see whenever I click here and then without adding any value I click outside the control, its color will get red, because whenever I click on this control, the ng touch class has been applied to this control, and because we have not filled any information in it, it's already ng invalid class has been applied there, so that's why its color get red. So the same way we can also display the messages on this form using these classes. Let's say if user has not entered any information in this email ID, then it will prompt a message that please enter email ID. So for this we need to make a check here which will display a message. So for this, to display a message, let's create a message here, and for this first of all let's create a break element here and then span which will display a message, please enter email ID, or you can say that email ID is required. So for this we need to make a check based on the classes touched and valid. So for this, first of all, let's create a variable, a local variable here, validate email, which will get the value of this control which is actually within this ng model, and we will create a check here, ng if, and we will check that whether this control is touched and this control is not valid. Let's save it, And you can see if I click here and if I click outside without entering any data in this control, then it will display email ID is required, and we have already applied a style that which will display this control with a red border. So we can also apply the classes within these input controls. So let me show you as well. But for this, let's add two classes here, one for valid state and another one for invalid state. So let's create a class here like form invalid, and when the form is invalid, then border color should be red, and when the form is valid, it's a name of this class form valid and form invalid, and in case of valid state its color will get green. So to check this, first of all let's comment this class and open our HTML page and use ng class to add the classes we just implemented. So for this, let's add the classes here using ng class, and for this we have to give a name to this control like we did with this email control. Then its name should be first name control and pass ng model to it, and here in class we will check that if the control has touched and the control is not valid, then let's wrap it in a bracket. Then what will happen? It will apply a class form invalid, and the same way if the form, if this control is valid, then apply a class valid. Let's save all the changes. And you can see if I did not fill any information, it will get red because we have applied form invalid class here, and if I add value in it, its border will get green. So we check that the validation we used is used with HTML or with the CSS, but we can also apply the validation from our source code, which we can say that a server side validation, and which is important to validate all of your validation from server side. So let me show you an example how we can validate our data from server side. So here when we submit the form, it will submit using this function user registration, and here within this form we need to validate the values received from the controls. So here we will write a logic to validate the controls value validation, and here we will apply validation for last name, where we will check that last name should enter more than 5 chars, and if the characters is equal or less than 5, then it will display a message to user and also return the statement. So for this, let's create a if condition here. If form value dot controls dot last name dot value dot length is less than or equal to 5, then what we will display, we will return the statement, and also we will display a message to user that last name should be more than 5 char in length. And to display this message on our view, we need to create a variable, and we'll use interpolation to display that message. So let's create a local variable here, validation message string, and assign a default value to it. And within this variable we will assign this message, and also we will display this variable here in a div. Let's save all the changes, and let's add mark, and instead of Smith we will add SM whose length is less than 5. And for email ID let's add Mark Smith and click on register, and you will show that we have displayed a message last name should be more than 5 char in length. You can also apply your validation here as well, because it's important to apply validation in server side as well as on client side. So we can also apply, because you can see that we see this message whenever user click on register button. We can also apply the same validation here as well. Minimum length should be 6. So let's save it, and till user did not enter the 6 char, the register button will not enable. So let's add again Mark. Instead of Smith let's add SM and email ID Mark Smith. Then you can see that still the register button is disabled because we have not fulfilled all the validations. So let's remove it, because we have applied a server side validation here. And let's go with Mark Smith, and our requirement is we need a character should be more than 5, and right now the length of Smith is 5. Then we can add 1 here, and we will submit the form here. So the same way we can also apply validation with reactive forms, but the style of applying validation in a reactive form is a little bit different. You can apply the validation from your server side code. You can also apply the validation on client side, but reactive form allows you to add the validation from server side, because we have maintained all our controls using form builders for reactive forms. So we will cover validations in reactive forms with few other properties like set values, patch value, value change, and status change in our next video. So in this session we have covered form validations using template driven form with AngularJS application. If you like the video, then please give a like to this video, and also if you have any query, just post a comment in comment box. You can also write to me at wavetutorials@outlook.com. If you require the source code of this session, you can get link of GitHub repository in description of this video. My name is Naveen, and thank you for watching this tutorial.